Hi, everyone. Want to welcome you to the Julia Watson lecture. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be doing the introduction. One of our students will be doing the introduction. So I will first introduce Julia Chu, who will introduce Julia Watson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for a presentation from Julia Watson. My name is Julia Cho. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate at the Syracuse School of Architecture and a representative of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee. Let me also now mention that if you'd like to enable closed captioning, you can click the CC button on the bottom of the Zoom interface and click Show Subtitles. We are very excited to have Julia Watson speak with us tonight about nature-based technologies for the built environment and climate-resilient design. Her best-selling book with Tashem, Low Tech, Designed by Radical Indigenism, has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, Monocle, Architectural Digest, and more. In her practice, which includes Julia Watson Studio, as well as her collaboration with horticulturist and landscape designer Marie Salambier as Watson Salambier, Julia approaches design through the rewilding of landscapes. Her portfolio includes the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, Pace Galleries, and Rockefeller Center, artist Rashan Johnson, and many others. Julie teaches at Urban Design at Harvard Graduate School of Design and at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. Julia has also written for Topos, Landscape Architecture Frontier, IOARC, Curb, Water Urbanisms East, and co-authored a spiritual guide to Bali's UNESCO World Heritage. She's a 2020 TED speaker, fellow of Summit Reality and PopTech, and the recipient of the Christensen Fund. On behalf of ARC 409, we are fortunate to host Julie Watson tonight. Not only does her work align with our specific learning objectives, but we believe her work is critical for all of our design studios here at Syracuse. Welcome, Julie Watson.
Hi, thank you so much, Julia. So hi, everybody. I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join us here this afternoon. And I wanted to actually open the lecture today by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional and the very, very snowy lands of the first people of Brooklyn, New York, the Lenape people, past and present, and I honor with gratitude both the land and the Lenape tribe. Myth is a word that it's taken from the ancient Greek, meaning it comes from the word mythos, and it means the story of the people, and it has guided mankind for millennia. About 300 years ago, the intellectuals of the European Enlightenment, they constructed what I see as this mythology of technology, and it was influenced by a number of things, the confluence of humanism, colonialism, racism, and in this map below, it really does start to express and really perfectly capture the ideology of the day. Up on the top, you can see this imperial aristocracy, then the colonialism and territorialization of the surface of the earth, which is underscored then at the base by the innovations of the day, or what they're called the instruments and curiosities of the day. And these are the technological innovations. And it was this mythology that really ignored local wisdom and indigenous innovation, deeming it primitive. And this was a mythology of technology that feasted on the felling of forests and the extraction of resources, and it was powered by the age of industrialization, and that distanced itself from nature, and it favored fuel by fire. And today, this is the legacy that still haunts us. And so we consider that the architectural artifacts of dead cultures are invaluable, like the 4,000-year-old pyramids of Giza, while those that are living and still in existence are being erased. And so here below is a perfect example of that. This is one of the communities that is written about in Low Tech. This is an image on the left of the floating islands and the mobile housing of the Madan people of the southern wetlands of Iraq. And on the right, you see a photograph of exactly the same landscape. This was once the landscape had been dried. It had been, Saddam Hussein had actually taken all the water out of the marshes and drained them by building huge dikes. was done in resistance for hiding Shiite Muslims. But this was, in a couple of seasons, an entire civilization of 6,500 years old was displaced and erased. Thankfully, now the civilization has been revitalized, as has the wetland been revitalized. But the idea that that this type of landscape and these technologies are so incredibly invaluable is really not finding its ground within the profession or really within some of the governments that are that these cultures and civilizations are underneath their regimes. So over the past 100 years, only a sliver of the technologies that actually existed at the time of the Enlightenment were valued enough to be shepherded through to the present. And that is part of the problem, that meanwhile, there has been this alternative mythology of nature-based technology that's actually been around since well before that time, that 300 sort of years ago time. And so while modern societies have been trying to conquer nature, what we find that Indigenous cultures have been really learning to work with it and over deep time, over a really long period of time. So today we're faced with an uncertain future. We're confronted by these climate events that we can't predict, by species extinctions that we seemingly can't prevent, and by these ecosystem failures that we can't stop. And so we're tasked as designers, and actually really, as humanity, we're tasked with developing solutions that can protect what we have that remains and transform those civilizations with which we are going to construct, with which we will construct. And so with this challenge and extending the grounds of what we're starting to see as this sort of climate resilient design, and we see that as emerging part of design, which roots really a very old understanding of design and technology. Low tech is a movement that looks towards the local technologies and cultures as an evolutionary extension of life that is in symbiosis with nature. So in 1966, the architect Cedric Price, he asked a really important question. He said, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And this provoked the field of design to question the impact of technology on cities, on architecture, and on society. And 60 years later, I think that we still find ourselves asking a really similar question. And that's, if sustainability is the answer, then what was the question? Because we keep on going up higher, we keep on going up wider, we keep on going deeper to extract. And then we ask, well, to what end will sustainability actually serve us? And, if you look back to the genesis of the term sustainability, which can be traced back to the Great Law of the Iroquois people and the 7th generation principle, which considers actions as they affect the 7th generation after them. How have we actually adapted that type of thinking? So we see ourselves somewhat drowning in this age of incredible amounts of information, while we're also starving for wisdom. And, while we have to develop this idea of the new mythology of technology that can really help us systemically change the conditions by which we inhabit the earth. And that's really going to be critical to advancing this coexistence with nature and also the sort of terms of our existence upon this earth. So this is actually an image taking you back to sort of where all this research and where my work began. This is an image of the neighborhood that I grew up in, and this is one of the most important sort of intersections in the neighborhood I grew up in Australia, in Brisbane. The neighborhood is called West End. It's actually it's a smaller area, a larger part of Brisbane that was occupied by the Turrbal and the Jagera people. And this area is called Kurilpa. And that means the place of the water rat. It's really near a river, the main river that runs through the city of Brisbane. And so this is the major intersection. It's now marked by the Aboriginal flag. It's on a street called Boundary Street. And that street was called boundary strip because it was the boundary about which Aboriginal people were removed from the center of the city after 4 p.m. And so this is the condition that I grew up in an area that was incredibly multicultural, where activism was a really lively part of the neighborhood. And so my research into Indigenous technologies, it actually began in my second year of architecture school. I went to a university that had a primary, and I think it was the first Aboriginal Environment Research Centre in Australia. And every single architecture student in their second year of architecture, they took a course called Aboriginal Environments. And that course really explored the built environment of Indigenous communities all over Australia, their architecture and their infrastructure. And it was through that seminar, which is a world famous seminar run by an incredible academic, Paul Memmott, who's an anthropologist and architect. That seminar really sort of brought to the forefront my understanding about how Indigenous local architecture and infrastructure in the built environment was designed incredibly symbiotically with nature. And that's a model that I haven't seen in education in all of the architecture schools that I've taught in, but I hope it's a model that will be adopted. And I think it's an incredible model that should be adopted in architecture schools. So this is one of the, on the screen, it's one of the images that I remember actually seeing in the seminar and studying this particular system, which could be anything by the look of this image, but what it actually is, it's the oldest human-made structure on Earth, and no one has probably seen this before. It dates back 40,000 years. This is what it is. This is a plan of actually what this infrastructure is. It's known as the Brereina fish trap, and it's a third of a mile long, and it sits on this rocky shelf in the bend of the Barwon River in New South Wales, and at the crook of this river is the township of Brereina. And so 40,000 years ago, this area at the crook of this river was established by putting large and small rocks onto this shelf to create a series of rock pools. So as fish swam through this area, they were trapped and then they were collected by hand, and it still exists today. And so last year when I was home for summer, it was during a time when 21% of the forests across all of Australia were burned by the worst wildfires we'd ever seen. It was called the Black Summer. And these fires were caused by a number of reasons. There was seasonal drought, there was delayed rains, there was underfunded prevention, but there was also these century-old bans on Aboriginal cultural burning practices. And then in the midst of this catastrophe, something really interesting happened. They found that the ancestral lands that still practice cultural burning, which you can see here, they were fine as the fires raged around them. And so these trees, they actually survived because of Indigenous pyrotechnology practices. Pyrotechnology is the use of fire as a technology in a landscape for management of ecosystems. And what it is, it's like a very slow burning that's guided by something called traditional ecological knowledge, which is also TEK, which is part of the title of the book. And that knowledge is actually passed down for generations. It's very specific to place, to soil, to different types of country. This is actually an image taken from gum tree country. So different types of burning regimes are very specific to something called a gum tree country, as would be, different to a mixed tree country. Different fires are lit during different times, and it has a relationship to the amount of moisture in the soil, moisture in the vegetation, and a whole number of factors that are very specific to place-based observations. But pyrotechnology doesn't just happen in Australia. It actually happens all over the world, and it's this global phenomenon of ecosystem management. It's relatively undocumented example of what in the book came out as simultaneous innovation. So here you can see two particular systems that were documented in the book, the Apete of the Kayapo in the Amazon and the Milpa of the Mayan. And the Apete are actually these forest islands that are created in the middle of the Amazon by using pyrotechnology that then create an agricultural landscape and a village. And then the Milpa is similar agroforestry system that is created to use created for agricultural gardens in the forest. And so this term simultaneous innovation actually was a realization that came out of all the research from the book, and it explains this scientific hypothesis that discoveries made independently often occur simultaneously. And so if you're familiar with this term simultaneous innovation, maybe you know one of the most infamous moments of simultaneous innovation, which was the co-discovery of evolution by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, which is a contested topic in itself. But so this phenomenon of simultaneous innovation, this was actually a really unexpected discovery that came out of the research for low tech, and it turned up again and again and again as we were looking at various different typologies, looking from rice terraces to islands to forest farming to desert farming to aquaculture. We would see the same types of innovations turning up in locations across the globe that had never had any form of communication. And so from that, I was led to understand that, you know, there are optimal designs to climate extremes when you're looking at different types of nature-based technologies. They vary in the forms of their control mechanisms and their materialities at a local scale, but there are vast similarities in these systems that you can understand as typologies. So this is the Three Sisters planting method, and it's another ancient technology that relies on something called species symbiosis. It's practiced by the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Pueblo, the Anasazi, the Tiwa, the Cherokee, and the Iroquois. And so what this is the croplands that are composed of corns and beans and squash, and they work together as a mutual support system for one another. And they're known as the Three Sisters, and they have been the principal diet of many different civilizations for a really long time. And so what I'm showing here is this is the Three Sisters of the Milpa system, which I showed before, which was also employing pyrotechnology. And of the Zuni waffle gardens that are found in a really arid pueblo in Zuni land. And so what you see here is the same technology used in really vastly different type of ecosystems, one in a forested ecosystem and one in an arid desert ecosystem, but both take advantage of two types of similar things. They take advantage of a micro topographical maneuver of berming that captures water in the system and allows for a combination of these different species to work with one another. And so they do that both as they perform and physiologically. What happens? They're called the Three Sisters because it's thought that the corn sister and the bean sister and the squash sister, they work together. It's showing it's a display and it's a story about mutual collaboration and support to achieve a collective goal. And what it actually does is the corn that's the structural support, the squash creates a microclimatic shading condition over this area. And there's the beans, which actually provide the nitrogen fixation in the soil. But something that's really interesting about this system, it's not actually often mentioned in discussions about this particular technology, is that biochemically, they also work together, and they do that by offering a really balanced diet, because with the corn, it lacks the amino acids, lysine and tryptophan, which the body needs to make proteins, and niacin, both of which the beans actually contain. So together, they give you a balanced diet working with one another. So over the past 20 years, with all this research, the focus of my work hasn't really changed that much since architecture school. And I've traveled around the world trying to prove this suspicion that I had that was inspired by that course in second year. And that was that some of our most sustainable innovations are actually rooted in cultures who'd been experiencing climate extremes on a smaller scale for a millennia. And so scientists, we have acknowledged today, we know we're in this period of the sixth mass extinction, but what we haven't acknowledged is that species extinction alone isn't going to be the 21st century's greatest loss. The same forces that drive species extinction, they actually endanger the local cultures, but they also endanger the local technologies that may actually hold a key to our survival. And these are technologies that I said have been evolved and passed through generations, but they've been evolved in response to flooding, to fire, to drought, to a lack of arable soil for agriculture, to sea level rise, and to severe weather events. And all of those things that I listed, they're exactly the same crisis that we're experiencing today. So these crises and these technologies, they're incredibly well adapted to these types of environments because they evolved from these extreme conditions. And not only that, these technologies are actually what play a key role in conserving global biodiversity. So they're very, very interdependent, and that's a conversation that's not being had. And these are the types of nature-based technologies that I write about in low tech. And if you're not familiar with the word low tech, if you're wondering why you haven't heard it before, it's actually a word that I coined, and it comes from a combination of two words. It comes from local and TEK, and I mentioned TEK before, traditional ecological knowledge. And it makes sense given the material in the book, but it's actually also meant as a provocation. So I started teaching technology 12 years ago, and all of the technology that I was coming across in all the books about the built environment at that time, most of it was high tech. And anytime that there was any discussion about what I now consider low tech, it was called low tech, LOWTECH. And it comes from this inherited sort of bias about local cultures and their technologies. And this body of work kept on being called low tech, which the definition of is unsophisticated or primitive. When in actuality, all these technologies, they're neither low tech nor primitive. They're really sophisticated technologies that embody all of today's sustainability principles, like low embodied energy, low impact, low cost, and forming closed loop systems. But not only that, they're derived from TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, which also might be a new term. And this is knowledge that has been universally ignored by the scientific community, and it's the foundational knowledge of the book. And it's broadly defined as the cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge, practices, and beliefs. And so to visualize TEK, this is actually an image that's taken from understanding the scientific writing of Fikret Burks, who teaches at University of Manitoba, and he talks a lot about traditional ecological knowledge. But TEK can be seen as a system of nested concepts, and it explains the construction of the world around you. And at the top, you can understand the individual, and then beneath that, the individual sits within their local ecosystem, and within that is the local understanding of your lands and your ecosystem. Underneath that, there is your land and resource management systems. Then beneath that is your social institutions, where you have particular forms of agency, like Syracuse University. And then underneath that exists your worldview, or your belief systems. And the dominant culture today, we have an understanding about worldview, but there are many, many, many different types of worldview or belief systems of different communities. And so, and they change. They have different types of conceptions. This can be sort of seen part of religion. It's not identified specifically. It's an understanding of where you exist in your world, and it becomes a commonality between a group of people as a lens by which you understand your place in the world. So the other part of the title is Design by Radical Indigenism. So Radical Indigenism is a philosophy of Professor Eva Marie Garut. She is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. It is not something that I made up. And Professor Garut, she argues for a rebuilding of knowledge through explorations of Indigenous philosophies that are capable of generating new dialogues for Indigenous communities. So in the context of today, revisiting understandings, philosophies, teachings, to explore different understandings of the world that we exist in today. In low tech, I applied this type of thinking to design and sustainability, and then argue for a new look at local technologies to inform how we think about sustainability and resilience. So low tech is also something that I see as a movement. It's a movement to rebuild our understanding of local knowledge, of technology, of vernacular design, to generate sustainable climate resilient infrastructures, and to acknowledge that there are hundreds of different technologies that are based upon place-based observation, that are nature-based technologies that are not even being acknowledged as technologies at this point. So we're at this moment where we can really either continue this incredibly narrow view of technology that's been informed by that distance from nature, or we can acknowledge that this is just a mythology about technology. And in our profession, even within our profession, it's just one way that humans can live and design with natural systems in response to climate change. And if we're going to get really serious about mitigating climate change, we also need to consider that the most effective way to do that is not by replicating a small number of high-tech, costly solutions that are developed by wealthier nations and accessible to about 30% of the world's population, or by acknowledging that all the climate solutions are going to be conservation areas that are already in existence. These two ideas just perpetuate this mythology that leaves 70% of the global population vulnerable and continues to sort of amplify these biases that were put in place about universal technologies and these inherited ideas about this one way that we can understand technology. So I want to go through a couple of examples that are in the book, I want to sort of talk about this idea that if we're really going to think resiliently, then the most effective way to mitigate climate change is to also recognize, not only recognize and not ignore high-tech or passive conservation areas, but introduce a third idea that solutions that are already in existence, that are embedded in the traditional ecological knowledge of community, can be an incredibly effective way of providing resilience at scale, if they are allowed to scale, if they're supported to scale. So this is a system called the Kanat. You can see it on the right here, this pock mark that's across the right-hand side of the screen. This is an underground aqueduct. This is how you know that there's an aqueduct traveling underneath the surface of the earth. And this is a technology that's found in the Middle East. It passively cools buildings while moving aquifer water across really vast distances. Here you see an image of a building that you would find above one of those pockmarks on the surface of the earth. They're actually wells that go down to the horizontal channel underneath the surface of the earth. And this system would sit above one of those wells. This is a building called a yakachal. And it creates an evaporative cooler. And what it does, it works to store ice that's for the summer that's actually made in the winter. And the way the ice is made is by wind coming through these tunnels above and water channeling below. And that creates evaporative cooling within the system, and then that creates ice. So this is a cutaway section showing you this through here. This is the Kanat, the underground aqueduct. These are the series of wells. So this system has been in use for 3,000 years, and it's incredibly meticulously designed. This channel that can cover really large, vast distances, it travels at a slope of 1 to 2 degrees, and they're experts that actually create these different types of underground channels. It's a particular job in society. And they were first constructed by the Persians, actually, to create the city of Tehran. They source, they direct, and they transport water underground from the mountains to the cities. And it's basically to reduce the loss of water by evaporation in a really arid environment. They start here with these series of wells that they create, and then the last well that they do is back here, where they tap into the aquifer, and that will then flood the system, and the water will flood all the way down to the villages and into the agricultural lands below. Here you can see another qanat making its way up on the left side, and there's sort of a series of qanats that's traveling to this village. They're several kilometers long. They have these vertical shafts, and that's about 20 to 30 meters between each of these wells that you see across the surface, leading to the settlement. And water conservation was obviously an incredibly high priority in this landscape. What's really innovative about this technology is that the water releases back onto the surface of the earth and then can make its way back into the aquifer rather than just a continual extraction. What also happens is if the aquifer is depleted, so the water level in the aquifer falls below the mother well, the system will actually stop working. So it has a system of checks and balances and inherent sustainability in the system. And so it won't allow for this continuous extraction. So it also serves as this model for integrating cooling into public open space and this idea of this sort of passive cooling technologies, as well as irrigation. So this is a second technology. It's actually found very close to the qanat. The qanat actually made its way, I should mention, the qanat made its way across the surface of the earth, through the Middle East, through Asia, through Europe, to the Canary Islands. You can find the system of the qanat everywhere. It has slightly different names and terminologies, but that's a system that spread very, very far from its origin. This is a system that is in Iraq. It's an islanding and a housing system, and it's made from a single species of reed. And this is a system that's known as the Al-Tala, and the islands and the Marif houses, and it's made by the Madan people who live in the southern wetlands of Iraq. I showed the image before, the comparative of their really vital and vibrant landscape when it was when the wetlands were full of water and working really successfully, and then after they'd been drained by Saddam Hussein. So this is an image of from the book, an illustration showing you how these islanding technologies are made. They begin by fencing a living reed and then building up layers of reed and mud to eventually form this floating platform. And then on top of that platform, they create these, what they call the Marif houses, which are these arched houses. And they've seen these houses depicted in Sumerian Uruk imagery. So estimates say that this is about a system that's about 6,500 years old. So this kasab reed is really integral to every aspect of life. Here you see a video of men actually creating these houses. So the kasab reed actually provides fodder for buffalo. It provides food for bread. It provides this incredibly biodiverse and biodegradable material for creating these houses and the islands. And the kasab reed is so versatile that it can be bundled into these really thick columns that are then sunk into the island and counterweighted to make the arches. It can be woven into walls, roofs, floors, and then it's even twisted into, you can see these ropes that bind the building, that's actually the kasabri, to be twisted into a rope that's used to bind the buildings without nails. And so these Madan villages, they're actually still being constructed. The Madan, the territory, the dikes were broken down after fall of the regime, and the area has once again been flooded. There are about 10,000 Madan people who have come back to live in the marshes, and these buildings are once again in the islands are being constructed. These islands actually stay afloat for about 25 years, and the houses, interestingly, can be deconstructed and moved in as little as 3 days. So they're incredibly mobile housing systems. So in other parts of the world where rivers are left contaminated with sewage, there's an Indian city of 15 million people that uses its floodplains to treat half of its wastewater. This is an image from the book showing the cycle of treatment of this wastewater to get it from about 95% water as it comes in and 5% waste, to reduce it down and also to have all these other benefits in the system. And so that process actually happens through a combination of sunshine and sewage and the symbiosis between algae and bacteria, which makes the wastewater break down. It then moves into a series of 300 fish ponds, and it continues to be cleaned by the fish, but also grows the food for the city. And that's a whole process, takes about 30 days. Here you can see where this system is located. It's on the edges of the city of Calcutta. It is flanked by this smoking escarpment of the city's trash, and then it's ribboned by all these highways, and you see these developments going up in the background of this system that is the wastewater treatment for the city of Calcutta, that has these 300 fish ponds that, while cleaning the water for the city, it's producing its food. And this innovation, it's not just a model for chemical and coal power free purification. It provides 100,000 jobs for the city, but it's the only way to treat the water coming from Calcutta, because there's no formal treatment system before it enters the Bay of Bengal. So moving past the case studies, I want to acknowledge that, as designers, our work is about having conversations with other designers, with allied disciplines, with people from our past, theorists from the past who've written about similar types of ideas. And one of those was Bernard Rudofsky. He had a seminal exhibition in the 1960s at MoMA called Architecture Without Architects, really inspired a generation of architects to start looking at vernacular design. And we can speak to others in our profession, we can speak to other professionals in our pasts, but we can also start speaking to other people. And this call for this new mythology of technology really needs us to have these broader conversations beyond the typical disciplines and beyond the traditional sciences, and it needs to involve knowledge holders of traditional ecological knowledge, and for us to have conversations with different types of people who can share their knowledge and want to share their knowledge about climate resilient design. And in the book, there is a series of conversations and interviews which does just that. And there's interviews with people like Jimenote, who he was a tribal elder of the Zuni, and he's the director of the Ashirawan Museum and Heritage Center. There's conversations with Jassim Al-Assadi, who provided the video of those men who were making that Marif house. And Jassim, he was born in the marshes. He is an engineer, he's a scientist, and he now leads an organization called Nature Iraq, whose mission is to protect the Madan culture. And he's been integral in the regeneration of the marshes and in bringing back displaced Madan people back to live in the marshes. And I've worked with Jassim many years ago, and we continue to have to work together through the book and through other projects. I worked with him on a wastewater treatment wetland park that was being designed in the marshes. And he was interviewed in the book in a section that was first published in his Indigenous dialect. The interviews are done in the Indigenous dialect, and then they're actually published they're translated and published in English. And it's this idea of working with local communities and local experts as well to understand these nature-based technologies and infrastructures that is a major point of difference to the typical discussion and the typical ways of working that I think really needs to be explored. So low-tech suggests that our nature-based technologies to climate change, they don't need to be passive. And I mentioned this before, that we don't need to think of passive conservation areas like protected wetlands and forests and carbon credits as the solution. We can think of active, adaptive, productive, and complex coexistences between human and natural and non-human species as climate solutions that use biodiversity as the building block to create a different and alternative future. And this is a really incredible example. This is the Akaja aquaculture system. It is located in Benin in West Africa. It is built by the Tefinu people. This is a completely aquatic city. And you can see all these squares on the screen. They're fish pens. And so this is a fishing society, specifically tilapia fishing society. And what these pens do, they actually cover about 2/3 of the entire surface of the lake, a shallow lake. And they create about 12,000 enclosed constructed fish pens. And that creates an artificial reef system. And that artificial reef system is incredibly attractive to one particular species, which is the tilapia, which is really great to eat. And so this is a way that these types of systems are creating these symbiotic relationships that are very beneficial, both for the biodiversity of the lake, but also for the community who actually inhabit this lake. And so I wanted to, as we're, all sitting here in our homes, sharing on screens and listening to lectures for the past year, I do want to acknowledge that we are in a pandemic. We're in a pivotal moment, and a pivotal moment both society globally, but also for our profession. And I think we're in this moment as a profession where we're caught with this fascination for high tech, where we really see our futures very focused upon smart cities and high technologies. And this idea of smart cities, where we're running cities on trillions of gigabytes of data, and that is generated to create the most efficient environments for the most growth. But this year, I think we've really seen a big shift, and COVID-19 has really sort of questioned some of the trajectories that we've been on, both professionally, but also globally. And I want to mention a couple of those. One of the most interesting things that I recognized, and this happened at the beginning of the pandemic, was the failure of artificial intelligence systems to respond to the really extreme conditions that were happening at the beginning of COVID. And so what happened when COVID-19 hit, people started buying all these different types of inventory, and algorithms had never experienced that. And all the AI technologies started to fail. They couldn't predict what people wanted. And because these machine learning models, they were trained on really normal behavior. And when the norm changed, they don't work. So when we're thinking of smart cities and we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking about the vulnerabilities that we saw in AI technology that are inherent within these kind of data-driven and smart cities and these ideas, we can already identify that there are going to be vulnerabilities if we're solely dependent upon these types of systems within our cities. And so this was sort of a line of thinking that was picked up throughout the pandemic. And earlier sort of last year, there was this article that came out in The Guardian. And it was written about something called excellent dumb cities, which I don't actually promote the term dumb cities completely, but it was really talking about the fact that we don't have to rely on the idea of data-driven smart cities, that we can really think about how some of our challenges really need to be faced not by new technologies or new ideas, that what we need is really the foresight and the courage to use the best of our old ideas. And sometimes we seem extremely short-sighted, and we forget to turn around and look back from where we've come from. And the article was really highlighting how smart cities that are run by algorithms will be exceedingly complex to manage with all sorts of unpredictable vulnerabilities. And that this is a shift that is similar thinking to what's happening actually with global economic trends. So if we zoom out from our profession, there was this whole other conversation that was happening during COVID that was about globalization and this concept that we might be nearing an end of globalization, or we might be transitioning to something different. And that thing that is different is called multipolarity, and this idea of a multipolar world. And how is this relevant to what we're talking about? How is this relevant to design? Well, I do a lot of consulting work, specifically in the innovation labs of some Fortune 500 companies. And so what is being seen is a big shift in reframing global material streams, industrial processes, and value chains to make them also less vulnerable and more resilient. And so we have, as a global society, we've been dominated by this idea of globalization since the late 20th century. And globalization is this idea of the interweaving of world economics through cross-border flows of goods, services, and capital. And that has been the prevailing trend, but we're seeing something else come to fruition. And that's this idea of a multipolar world and multipolar economics. And what we're seeing emerging is that nations are pursuing these independent economic strategies, and they don't follow the same direction of other global power centers. And so this is this emerging idea of regionality, of diversity, of local circularity. And that's actually really synonymous with some of the thinking and ecosystem-based thinking of low tech. And it starts to set up different types of understandings about what are the alternative futures of the world that can be brought back into how we think about design. And so some of that is starting to happen. And I'm trying to bring a lot of that type of thinking into my practice. And respond to some of these emerging trends that I'm seeing, both with the consulting work mostly, but also at a local scale in some of the design work. And so in the office that I share with at Watson-Salembier, we've been working, I'll show you one sort of project. We've been working to translate some of these ideas into practice, and we explore this idea of hyperlocalism. And in the studio, we define hyperlocalism as this untaming of urbanism towards a radical localism, where biodiversity becomes the building block of diverse local symbioses. So we've been working actually at the Rockefeller Center. It's an ongoing project. It began last summer, and it's really this idea of a rewilding strategy. It has much larger connotations, but it's finding its ground right now locally on the Rockefeller campus, both internally and externally. And it was initially an idea that was manifested in a summer installation that was in the ice rink and in the Northern Plaza, where we really focused on amplifying the ecological benefits that we could bring to small urban spaces through the use of native species, specifically pollinators and melliferous species that attract pollinators in the landscape of Midtown, which is a pretty hard landscape. But also thinking in the context of of Central Park, and the idea is to create spaces and habitats within the urban environment that are island habitats where these species can connect to extend their territories and their grounds within this landscape. So what's interesting about Rockefeller Center is it was actually also about 200 years ago, about 100 years ago, it was the site of the first botanic garden in North America. It was home to about 2,000 native and exotic species that were cultivated in what was called the Elgin Botanic Garden. So before we did this installation, if you think what was 100 years ago, came down to about now there's about 10 different species that are planted within some of the spaces in Rockefeller Center. The Channel Gardens are a little bit more diverse, but in these spaces there are about 10 different ornamental species. And so in our installation, we actually had an idea that we were only going to introduce native species, only introduce native species of the American meadow. And we introduced over 60 different types of native species into this landscape to try and bring back that language of botany and biodiversity to the city as this sort of educational experience about pest-resistant and drought-tolerant alternatives to ornamental species. And it's an ongoing project. We're still replanting. We did a reinstallation 2 weeks ago. But what's really interesting is even before we finish planting on a planting day, there are bees and butterflies buzzing all around. So in this landscape that is incredibly hard and in the center of Midtown, you really do find you can recreate these pockets of biodiversity. So another thing that I wanted to cover was this idea of like, what are the general principles that you can get from an understanding of low tech and perhaps apply to allied disciplines? So last summer, I was interviewed by a tech forecaster, interestingly. His name is Peter Hessendal, and it was interviewed it's a Danish innovation and tech magazine and a business magazine. And Peter wanted to talk about the book, and from that wanted to generate a set of 6 principles that really guide all of these nature-based solutions, not looking at them like a designer, like I would as sort of typologies, but really looking at what are the commonalities and how can you look at this as a sort of a steering system. And what he came up with is that, nature is not this separate steering system that we must shield ourselves against. That was the sort of big point. But individually, the points were, nature-based solutions are symbiotic. They're based upon these mutual benefits. They have more than one function, and they create gains for many on many scales. Number 2, they utilize natural ecological processes instead of modern industrial processes, but with similar and often really much more complex results. And number 3, humans are an essential part of these ecosystems. They're not separate. These ecosystems would not exist without the humans, and the humans would not exist without ecosystems. They're actually called socio-ecological systems, is a scientific term. Number 4, long-term. They're long-term and they're designed to last and function over generations. And that's what I go back to in the very beginning when I talked about sustainability and the origins of the term sustainability and why we don't think about the idea of future generations when we're thinking about sustainability in the built environment. And they're often handed down from previous generations. And number 5, they're adapted to the local conditions. And that's what we see as a very important part of these systems is they're place-based observations that are specifically adapted to local conditions. But we find similar local conditions in similar biomes all across the earth. So it doesn't have to be exactly site specific thought of. It can be thought of as also ecosystem specific, and that they're cyclical, where resources are recycled and the work follows the seasons. So in October, the design issue of the T magazine, Nikhil Saval wrote that amidst pandemics and environmental disasters, designers and architects have been forced to imagine a world in which the only way to move forward is to look back. And I don't want to say low tech doesn't suggest that we go back to living in a traditional way like Indigenous communities, but that we can learn a lot from these nature-based technologies to climate change and to symbiotic systems. Thinking by thinking in systems and symbiotic thinking that is predictive and adaptive and based upon place-based observation. So low tech is a movement that is seeding creativity in crisis. It's inspired by technologies that are born from climate extremes, and it rebuilds our understanding about the potential to create nature-based solutions that are sustainable and climate resilient, and that work in symbiosis, that look at local technologies and vernacular design as an inspiration to understand. So as designers, our role is to create these new grounds for positive engagement with nature, and in support of a new type of nature-based technology. So we can't go backwards, and we can't go and fix all of the causes and the extractive activities that have exacerbated the climate crisis that we're experiencing, but we can go forward, we can rethink, and we can rebuild in a way that supports the resilience of communities and cities while addressing also the inequalities and distance from nature that the current system supports. And so climate change, it's shown us that our survival is not dependent upon superiority, but upon symbiosis. And so shifting that thinking of survival of the fittest to survival of the symbiotic, it's a really critical first step. Survival as a symbiotic is actually, there's a book that's written by Lynn Margulis that talks about fluid dynamics and all about this idea of symbiotic relationships as a foundation for life. And so really, low tech is just asking you to question what we could learn from thousands of years of nature-based cultures and knowledge about how to conceive of a new narrative about a global nature-based cultural understanding that's led by Indigenous knowledge holders, that community leaders, by scientists and designers. And it really is, I think, time for us to conceive of a new narrative and to frame the context through which we can actually evolve and create an alternative future. Thank you.
Thank you. Just for anyone who didn't see the chat, if you have any questions, feel free to share them below. So I have a question from Professor Bartosh. In places like New York City, where evolution has moved so far past Indigenous architecture, where would a student begin to apply low-tech principles amid a sea of concrete?
Always a good question. And it turns around to, a lot of different questions about how we've developed, about appropriateness of scale, about ecological footprint, about how do we discover technologies that are being completely erased, how would they be applied, whether it's applicable that they would be applied. And also, low tech is not talking about taking technologies from, in most cases, found in the global south and extracting them and applying them in a landscape like New York. But there are general principles, and that's exactly what I went through, that idea of the 6 general principles that came from that article and that interview about cyclical, about symbiosis, about creating designs that have multi-scalar beneficial relationships, about trying to, think about sustainability as a process that's about the past, but also about thinking much longer term into the future. So those type of larger scale principles, those can be applied. The typologies, if you start to think about, well, what sort of a landscape do we live in? Is it a wetland ecosystem? Is there islanding technologies? Is there coastal technologies? Those types of technologies as typologies, they can definitely be thought of as a typology, not as an extractive technology that's then reapplied in a landscape like New York. But I think mostly the message of low tech is really about asking designers to talk to different communities and saying that there's knowledge beyond just our practice in terms of technology, and that we don't have to, as designers, move around the world as expert practitioners applying technologies from our culture to cultures that already have technologies. But there's a major need to recognize that a lot of the time when we're working in different locations around the world, there are existing technologies that work far better than the expertise that we have, but we can apply our expertise to understanding how those technologies work, to involving different peoples and voices on teams, to bringing in Indigenous experts, to evolve strategies that amplify and scale and are incredibly beneficial in situ to the technologies that already exist. So I wouldn't say that low tech is specifically about understanding what's the applicability in my backyard. I think there's a much broader engagement, but it doesn't disqualify the fact that you can think about broader principles and typological solutions that could be evolved and be inspired by different typologies that are found in the book.
Thank you, Julia.
Another question that a couple of students had, how did you spoke a lot about the designer's role with distributing this kind of knowledge. And I'm curious to know about your approach to in-person travel, exploration, and research. How did you determine the initial locations of your travels? How did you visit and study these local communities as an outsider? And how did you navigate the concerns over intellectual property rights when conducting your research?
So it's different for every single different case. And just like, you know, diversity is really essential in all of these systems. There was a diverse approach that evolved over time as well. Initially, I was invited to work on one system, which was the Subak system in Bali. I was invited to work with a community of scientists, local experts, to work on a tourism management plan and a cultural conservation plan for the preservation of the Subak rice terraces once it had been ratified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So that research actually came about through a project that was on the ground. The second site and community that I worked with was the Madan people, and I was invited to work on that by actually some other professors who had been working with the Madan, and by Jassim Al-Asadi, who's Madan. And so those two particular projects were actually through engagement directly with community and experts in that community, scientific experts. And then I started teaching a course, and I was teaching technology at Columbia, and I was mostly teaching high tech, but then I started to split the lectures up into high tech and low tech. And then I would get students who would do projects, and most of the students are international. So students would do projects about their technologies that they would find from the countries that they had come from. And a lot of that work was about looking at technologies and trying to talk to local experts, doing field work by the students, and sort of producing sort of the initial kernels of some of the work. And then there's just been a lot of travel since. There's not every single community I visited. You can write a book over 7 years with a very, very small limited amount of funds, but you can't travel to every single site. But there is being communication with different members of the community, so NGOs, different members of communities, and so that will evolve the research as well. And there's also collaboration, writing collaboration with different experts from those communities. And I think right now all the writing that we're doing involves direct collaboration with groups of scientists and experts, and slowly evolving designers and well into that process. So it's a sort of a large and differentiated approach, based upon different types of communities and accessibility and relationships that are evolved over time. Some of the work was actually written and we couldn't find members of the community who were willing to allow us to talk about knowledge, and so those chapters were never published. And so there's always that sort of conversation that's happening. That's why I spoke about conversation in the lecture as being a really important part of the work, and also recognizing who to have a conversation with.
Next, we have a question that Sean would like to ask.
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. I really, really appreciate it. My question is there possibly a resistance to this low-tech school of thought by even the very same indigenous people that you were talking about? I can supplement my question with a personal anecdote. So I have your book right here. I really appreciate that you included this project in the front cover, the Living Tree Root Bridges in India by the Khasi people. I'm actually Khasi myself. And the thing is, I wasn't born in any of these villages. I was born 50 kilometers away in the capital in Shillong. And the capital looks, even though it's the exact same climate and the exact same people, it's a completely different urban condition than what we see in the front cover over here. And this is a conversation my cousins and I talk about, sometimes, that we visited these bridges and we ask ourselves whether we'd actually live in these places, and it's a very strong, resounding no. And I don't think it's because we don't think we'd be able to live in these places, but it's because of the idea that the city carries. It's, it's a place for ambitions and collaborations, but in order to facilitate the density of a city, would these kind of like low-tech technologies be able to be introduced in that kind of density?
So what was the question?
So the basic question is there resistance to like low-tech technologies?
From the communities?
Yeah, in urban conditions.
In urban conditions.
Denser, yeah.
I mean, that for specifically, if these systems are in urban conditions already, there's always such a complex argument. Say, for example, the East Calcutta wetlands. That's a really incredibly unique system. It recycles the waste. It's a community-led system. You have to be a farmer for generations, or a fisherman farmer for generations to actually work in that system. It's only been around for about 120 years, the system, but it provides this incredible service, this free service for the government and for the community and for the city. What's happening now is that land is being filled in, and basically housing is going up. And so the system, we're finding the system is threatened, and it's conserved by a Ramsar Convention, but that's not particularly being upheld. So yes, there's all these different ways that these systems are often contested. They're contested by their local governments, by their federal governments. They're sometimes contested by different people who want to sort of change the type of, have introduced land transformations. Specifically with the East Calcutta wetlands, the difference is the system provides a free service that saves the city $20 million, but the government can't tax because you need to have land to then tax people that live and own that land. So that's why there's support for a transition to fill in the wetlands and transition that to a different type of landscape. So that's where that threat is coming from. For the Khasi themselves, in those particular villages, I think that there could be an idea that there might be a way that we could be inspired in the future to think about a hybrid living structure. We've done studies with Bureau Happold about that particular system to look at the efficiency of how it's created and to see whether, is this even an efficient way to carry load as a bridge? And Bureau Happold came back and said, this is an incredibly efficient way that's driven both by human intervention. through the scaffolding and through the creation of the bridge, but also by natural intervention, by the way the forces want to work, by the forces of the river, by wind, by everything, all the elements, really sculpting the way that that bridge works. And it's a bridge that it gets stronger with age. You know, it takes 50 years to grow. The applicability of a particular type of system being grown in a city may not be that you're growing bridges, but maybe you can be inspired. And there has been work that's been done by a German university being inspired by the fact that you could create a canopy system that could provide shade through a scaffolded system using that particular tree. So there are other ways and other uses, but the essential performance is a scaffolding and a training system that could be used to create different types of interventions in an urban environment that really does use the same idea of the technology, but doesn't take that particular technology and think about its specific applicability in a river corridor in Mumbai. You know, interestingly, now the Khasi are threatened by a new type of system that's being put in place by the Indian government, where there's a new system of taxation and subscription for the villages to be able to, they're trying to get UNESCO World Heritage listed to be able to receive benefits and support for the UNESCO World Heritage listing. So I mention that because in terms of your question, sometimes it's not the particular community, it's the particular governing nation state that is actually making problems and issues and evolving different economic and social conditions that don't abide with the types of cultural conditions of the community. And that's where you're seeing a lot of this contestation that's occurring. So, and you know, for every community there's a very different specific condition, but that's kind of a long answer to a great question. Yeah, and we support the Living Bridge Foundation. We support a lot of there's a lot of communities working on the ground that sort of we're still working with, who are really incredibly active and proactive at trying to sort of to really keep these cultural traditions alive.
We have one final question from Alicia, and I think it's kind of related to what you just touched upon.
Hey, first of all, thank you so much. I think it's been a wonderful lecture, and like, thank you for all the amazing work you're doing. I'm actually not an architect, I will say. I'm like an earth systems, human environmental systems major, but it's really cool to see there's so much interest in this kind of thing coming from like that perspective. So my question was kind of touching upon, so you mentioned earlier the importance of your work to developing climate resilience strategies or in developing nations. And my question was, how do you think we can go about, and I know this is a very broad question, that it does depend on the country and the government, but is there a general strategy for engaging governments and businesses within the developing world? So we can frame this kind of work as an opportunity for governments to support their own local communities and kind of support sustainable development from the ground up, like using their own knowledge systems rather than necessarily like importing knowledge systems from the West.
I would say that there is the opposite. So there are all the systems that are put in place right now to support the types of understandings of technology that we have now, and to support the idea of climate solutions being passive conservation areas. There's not the support for these types of systems, both the knowledge, the practice, and the community being engaged as being already existing on the ground, working resilient infrastructures that, given half the chance and given the right support, could scale and could be really beneficial as a form of climate resilience that's affordable, that's socially equitable, that's environmentally equitable, that already exists in the global south. And there's issues that I'm actually writing an article about this right now. It's a really great question. Thank you for asking it. But there's major issues in terms of what I see in terms of the way there's money is being distributed for climate solutions on a global scale, where this sort of alliances have been made many years ago, 12 years ago, between different international intergovernmental organizations and what they support. And what we're seeing is that there's a lot of support going to the idea of carbon crediting, and the carbon crediting through some of the major donor institutions which control the billions of dollars that are going towards climate change solutions. They're funneling a lot of money towards pre-existing areas that are already being conserved, and then using those credits to selling them to corporations, so that the cycle of the global north being able to, you know, pollute as much as they want at the expense of the global south, that's just being repeated. And so that's where they think that and I think it comes with this idea that, well, climate change solutions, they're going to be new, and we've got these new ways of thinking about it. Conservation areas aren't new. It's just a rebranding of already existing frameworks of conservation that were put in place 100 years ago. That if we look at climate change and we look at the number of conservation areas around the world, they've both seen an upward curve. So we know that that's actually not working in deterring the, you know, expansion of climate change. So we need this third model to work in coincidence, and we need to understand that, you know, if we were to support financially, in terms of business, in terms of female entrepreneurs or female communities on the ground, that's a means by which we could, you know, turn the burner on and turn up the heat to expand existing in place climate solutions on a global scale. That isn't about, you know, that's about like emergent systems. That's the way these things are going to work, but there has to be a recognition that there needs to be governmental support and needs to be support at some of the highest levels to recognize that these technologies are incredibly invaluable, and they need to be scaled, and they can be scaled, but there needs to be a strategic way that that support system gets to those communities.
Thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you again, Julia, for your lecture this evening. I can tell by the questions that were coming through in the chat, there was quite a bit of engagement by both students and faculty. So we'll give you the virtual round of applause that happens on all Zoom lectures. Again, just sincere gratitude for your time.
I've never seen a virtual round of applause, but that's a first. Thank you everyone for coming along. I know that we're all completely zoomed out, but I really appreciate the opportunity to share all this work and to spread these ideas, and I hope that you keep on spreading them.
Thank you, Julia. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.